DNA, transcription, RNA, translation, protein. It's called the central dogma. Every living thing does it this way, and there are very few differences from things as simple as a bacteria to as complex as an elephant or whatever. Okay, so it's a pretty universal process, hence the name central dogma. The other kind of communication we do is communication that allows cells to communicate with each other or different parts of the body to communicate with each other. And we know that's chemical communication there. So you will have a cell that will secrete a chemical. And it can either be transported by the bloodstream or just through interstitial fluid to a target where it will interact with a receptor. And that receptor then, once it binds to that receptor, that will trigger a response. So target cells are targets because they have receptors that have an ability, an affinity to recognize that particular signal. The signals go everywhere in the body, but the only cells that respond are cells that have a receptor for that signal. And then, of course, you're aware that a lot of communication is electrical. And we'll talk about these things called action potentials as being a kind of reversal of ion polarity and things like that. And that will serve as our electrical spark, if you will, this kind of flowing of ions. But this is all of our electricity is all about ions moving across cell membranes. So here we have to talk about ions, and the biggies are sodium and potassium, okay, and how they flow across cell membranes and being able to predict in which direction and why they will move is something we'll have to talk about there. So that's going to be important. So to maintain homeostasis, you need to have this ability to do this information flow and processing. So what do we mean by homeostasis? The root words there, I've kind of broken down what they are. Homeo means similar. Okay. And stasis, there are two ways to think of stasis. Stasis can be a root derived from the word static, which means constant. But in this case, stasis is the word means condition, which is also another meaning of the word stasis. Okay. So homeostasis just means similar condition. The coin was popularized, or the term was popularized in the early part of the 1900s by this guy Walter Cannon, and he basically described it as the fact that named the ability of the body to maintain a relatively stable internal environment. So essentially homeostasis is keeping this environment stable. It's returning this body back the conditions back to some optimal level after they have changed. Okay. And it really involves an interaction between three compartments: the outside world, so your external environment, and your internal environment. And your internal environment is really broken down, it's all water, right? Okay. And that water is stored in two different compartments: extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid. And did we talk about which one is the most? Intracellular, yeah, about 2/3 of all your water is inside of cells, right? And about 1/3 of it is extracellular fluid. And what are the two compartments for extracellular fluid? Interstitial and blood plasma. Interstitial and blood plasma. So those are two places where we have, extracellular fluid, and that has to all interact with each other. So you can see that this ability or this need for regulation and communication, whatever, is because all of these different compartments interact. The extracellular fluid is what is in contact with the external environment, and intracellular fluid here is in contact with extracellular fluid, depending upon whether, if this was a blood cell, this would be blood plasma. Anywhere else in the body, this is just, systemic tissues or whatever, and this is interstitial fluid. And they have to be able to regulate each other. And what's interesting is that the cell membrane is what regulates the movement of contents between all of these compartments. And cell membranes are interesting from a standpoint of their chemistry because the middle part of the cell membrane, without getting into it too much right now, is lipid and is hydrophobic. So it's nonpolar. So in chemistry speak, you should realize that if you want something to be soluble as a solute, it has to share the same chemistry as the solvent. So if water is a polar solvent, the things that will dissolve in it must also be polar. Things like ether is a nonpolar solvent, so what's soluble in that are things that are also nonpolar, or lipids. So the cell membrane regulates that. But interestingly enough, water, which is very polar and hydrophilic, is still freely permeable across the cell membrane, which is kind of interesting. It's got to do a little bit with its chemistry, the bond angles and things like that, the fact that it's small, but it can pass freely through the phospholipid bilayer. And that'll be important for us later on.